Truthspresso episode 319.
He's promising a bloodbath.
A bloodbath.
If he loses, in his word.
Donald Trump has openly vowed if reelected, he'll be a dictator on day one.
A dictator on day one.
All he said was, it's not that serious. Just inject a little bleach into your arm. You'll be all right.
Just inject a little bleach into your arm.
Americans aren't stupid. He was talking about a bloodbath. Sometimes a bloodbath means a bloodbath.
Americans aren't stupid.
Hey there, friends, family, foes, and lurkers alike. This is your host for Truthspresso, Daniel Minnick, coming at you with another exciting episode. And if you looked at the title of that episode, yes, you read that right. Did Trump really say that? Part 5? And I did not have this particular part in the works or in planning. I never intended to do a part 5 of this, but attenuating circumstances seem to demand that, because an article came out in The Atlantic on Tuesday, October 22nd, by the infamous Jeffrey Goldberg, who seems to be the one often in The Atlantic to write bombshell articles about Donald Trump. So I have to say to The Atlantic, don't make me do another episode in this series. Jeffrey Goldberg, don't make me do it. Jeffrey, don't you dare. Okay, I guess I'll do it. So for the 5th episode in this Did Trump Really Say That series, part 5, we're going to look at 2 hoaxes related to something Trump said. And believe it or not, both of these hoaxes come from the same article. And yes, that article in question is the article from The Atlantic. So, Jeffrey Goldberg, one of the premier writers for The Atlantic, on October 22nd, as I had mentioned just a bit ago, wrote a bombshell article entitled, Trump, I Need the Kind of Generals That Hitler Had. And, of course, we'll provide a link to the article in the show notes. And so, from the body of the article, after he talked about some other things, and the second hoax we're going to get into is actually what Mr. Goldberg addressed first, but he provided a story that's more of the bombshell from the article than this particular issue, which I'll explain. But he kind of did that to lay the groundwork to get your blood boiling so that he can then reveal the idea that Trump said that I need the kind of generals that Hitler had. And so as we read down the article, from a snippet of it, it says, quote, I need the kind of generals that Hitler had, Trump said in a private conversation in the White House, according to 2 people who heard him say this. People who were totally loyal to him that follow orders, unquote. So that last part is another alleged quote to Trump. So Trump supposedly said in full, I need the kind of generals that Hitler had. People who were totally loyal to him that follow orders. Now, Jeffrey Goldberg, to his credit, does seem to incorporate parenthetical asides in the article, where likely as he was researching this, as he was making contacts in the process, of course, the article is the way he wanted it, but to his credit, I guess if we could grant that, he did include things from people that he had had contact with who disputed some of the things that were attributed to Trump. So the Atlantic article includes people like Alex Pfeiffer, a Trump spokesman. Goldberg says that he emailed him and said, quote, this is absolutely false. President Trump never said this, unquote. And it could be that Mr. Goldberg put that in there just to show that hey, a Trump spokesperson, someone who's helping out his campaign, is just flapping his gums to deny something that insiders actually heard Trump say. Now, Jeffrey Goldberg doesn't actually say who heard Trump say these particular comments, because he kind of just flushes that in with other things that other people have heard him say certain things, such as Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, and Trump's former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, and says some of the things that they claim that Trump said. But as far as the quote attributed to him that was intended to be the headline of this article, that's just two anonymous sources who claim that Trump said that. But of course, that's all it takes for the esteemed Jeffrey Goldberg to make a headline of an article in The Atlantic, and then through the ripple effect, he will skip that stone in the pond, and then all the other outlets start doing it, and then various media sources will have the quote from the article, and then people on social media, of course, just say that Trump said that. So it's nice when you have that kind of influence to be able to have a hearsay claim of something that Trump said that isn't confirmed on tape, that isn't written down and transcribed as like a transcript from a particular event and stuff. It's just, I overheard Trump say this, or he kind of whispered it to me off camera and stuff. And if it's from someone who was party to some of Trump's meetings, but later on doesn't really like Trump much, he kind of grew to have a distaste for Trump over time and have reservations of Trump getting a second term. Well, some people, it seems, you can tap into them, especially 2 weeks before an election, to claim that Trump said certain things and report on it where timing is impeccable. Now, is this claim that Trump said, "I need the kind of generals that Hitler had," really newsworthy? As I said, precisely 2 weeks before Election Day, The Atlantic reports something people may have forgotten from 2 years ago. Wait a minute. So this has been something that was said 2 years ago? Well, let's look at a New York Times article from August 8th, 2022, written by Michael D. Shear, and the headline is, "Trump asked aide why his generals couldn't be like Hitler's," book says. So way back in August 2 years ago, we have a similar headline. And from the New York Times article, here's a little snippet. It says, quote, "Why can't you be like the German generals?" Mr. Trump told John Kelly, his chief of staff, preceding the question with an obscenity, according to an excerpt from The Divider, Trump in the White House by Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, published online by The New Yorker on Monday morning. And the next paragraph of the article says, quote, "The excerpt depicts Mr. Trump as deeply frustrated by his top military officials, whom he saw as insufficiently loyal or obedient to him," unquote. And that does sound a little like this statement from the 2024 Atlantic article we were looking at. Quote, "A desire to force U.S. military leaders to be obedient to him and not the Constitution is one of the constant themes of Trump's military-related discourse," unquote. So it seems to be something that this particular quote and claims about Trump demanding absolute obedience from high-ranking military officials in his cabinet, that seems to be a frequent refrain from news sources. Now, again, why is this news then? Why did the Atlantic article, with most of its focus on the next hoax that we'll talk about, title its headline, "Trump, I need the kind of generals that Hitler had," as if we didn't have articles with similar titles 2 years ago? You know what that tells me? That The Atlantic and Jeffrey Goldberg think their readers are mindless drones with very short attention spans. Now, most people have an opinion about Donald Trump, and we kind of see the person that he is as being a lifelong businessman, and a businessman who has employees and has a vision for the way he wants things to be is likely to expect his employees to do things that he tells them to do. Now, not necessarily like Hitler barking out orders, but, as Trump became president, he thinks of the country and the position that he holds as similar to how he would be the owner or CEO of a company, and he's used to giving people things that he expects them to do. And how is this then going to be different if he's the commander-in-chief telling people who are under him as members of his cabinet, can you go do this? And if they have resistance to it, then it kind of gives the idea of an employee in a company on the payroll not doing what the boss says to do. Now, of course, there are ways you can be humble as a CEO or as a boss in a company, but if you're the boss, somehow you really should be able to tell someone to do something as long as it's perfectly fine to do. But of course, now think about it. We mentioned John Kelly. Another one was General Mark Milley, both of them being positions of chiefs of staff. They're both generals in the military, and they're used to giving orders themselves. They're used to being the high rank. For years, they've had to bark out orders to subordinates according to military procedure. It's common practice to kind of shout out to people under you, if you're a general, to do something. And these two have been used to just doing that, and I can't blame them for that, and I can't blame them for how they are as officers in the military. That's what they're used to. And so when it comes to someone like Trump, who's never been in the military, a high-ranking general is probably going to look at someone like Donald Trump, who had never been in the military, as not really someone that they like to give them orders when they're generals. But as the nationally elected president of the United States, Trump, one of his job titles is commander-in-chief, so he's the head of the armed forces. And so he's the general of generals. And so when you've been in military culture for a long time and you're used to giving orders, as Trump hired them on and they accepted for the presidential cabinet, it's going to be hard for generals to take orders from a civilian, especially one who acts like a CEO and is used to telling employees what to do. As I said, it's understandable that 4-star general is going to feel like it's a joke for a lifelong civilian to give him orders and treat him like he had better obey or he could relieve him of the position. But that's the way our Constitution set things up here. There's a reason that the president is a duly elected civilian. Now, of course, there have been plenty of presidents who have served in the military, and that can be good or it can be bad depending on the person. But if a general feels insulted that a civilian who's a duly elected president and general of the generals has the power to hire and fire and has the power to dictate what his cabinet do, and feel ultimately insulted, yes, of course, I understand that, but the reason the Constitution doesn't set up a Praetorian system in which the military are the ultimate authority over the civilians, like they're a police state or such, there's a good reason for that. And the military always has been and should be a voluntary fighting force for protecting the nation. So if you're sore about the way Trump might have treated you, that doesn't give you a reason to be able to claim that Trump said something if he didn't really do it. Now, Trump could have said something, but we don't really have any hard evidence, it seems. Now, as far as campaign purposes, it's not as if Donald J. Trump is uniquely Hitler or praises Hitler, or talks like Hitler, or gets his ideas from Hitler, or likes Hitler's generals. Every Republican candidate, it seems, has been Hitler for quite some time. I saw an article from the Washington Examiner responding to the allegations here and all the news and hoopla over the Atlantic's article on October 24th, so 2 days after the Atlantic article, by Christopher Tremogli, entitled Reductio ad Hitlerum, 60 Years of Democrats Falsely Calling the Republican Nominee a Fascist. And I'll provide a link to this article, of course, in the show notes, and Tremogli chronicles how the Republican nominee has often been directly or indirectly compared to Hitler for the last 60 years, starting with Barry Goldwater in 1964. Barry Goldwater, who was one of the strongest limited government candidates ever. Well, I guess the apple doesn't fall from the tree for this current crop of left-leaning, Democrat-supporting journalists. A political ad had Hitler wearing a mask of Richard Nixon, and the ACLU claimed that Gerald Ford's policies would have let the Nazis off the hook in Nuremberg. Gerald Ford, who at the time carried the aura of a teddy bear. And Ronald Reagan, of course, was accused of deriving his ideas from Mein Kampf. Well, we know he fought the ongoing Cold War with the Soviets, and some leftists seem to think that everything that isn't socialism is fascism, so of course we understand that from the 1980s. And George W. Bush was next. Now, perhaps Reagan's vice president and successor, George Herbert Walker Bush, was just too milquetoast for this article to discover if any Third Reich bombs were hurled his way. But his son, George W. Bush, faced the fiercest lashings to date for his time as being like a Nazi. And of course, finally, before Trump, we have Mitt Romney as the Republican nominee bearing the criticism. And of course, now, because he's not a fan of Trump, just kind of like Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney seems to have his favor with the Democrats. It seems like the Democrats are willing to accept former Hitlers against the current Hitler. And so what does that really give us when we're thinking of the current state of the Democrat Party? It looks like a house divided, as when people accused Jesus of casting out demons by the power of the devil himself. A house divided against itself cannot stand. And now Democrats have former Hitler on their team. I mean, George W. Bush himself has refrained from endorsing Kamala Harris, as some Democrats had hoped, but Dick Cheney himself, he has actually endorsed Kamala Harris. Dick Cheney. And of course, I'll provide a link in the show notes to an article from U.S. News from 2008 in which George W. Bush and really Dick Cheney was kind of Hitler. So the Democrats have invited the evil mastermind, Satan himself, Dick Cheney, to their party. Why? To fight against Hitler? So they willingly let a Hitler on their team to fight against Hitler. Will the real Hitler please stand up? Oh yeah, it's always the one currently running or in office that matters. You must turn in your Hitler card once you have finished office or no longer are qualified to run for office. Then you're free as a former Hitler to be welcomed with open arms by the anti-fascist Democrats. Now, Snopes has evaluated the claim from The Atlantic that Trump said, "I need the kind of generals that Hitler had." And Snopes rates the claim unproven. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's just because there's no concrete evidence other than claims that he said it and claims that he didn't. It's two anonymous sources. And that sounds a lot like the 2020 article in The Atlantic that we talked about in the last episode of this series about Trump claiming that fallen World War I soldiers were suckers and losers. And that's why he refused to go to the cemetery when it was really because of the rain. And that at that time, they said it was anonymous sources. So why not keep pulling the anonymous source card to write headlines 2 weeks before an election? According to Snopes, quote, Goldberg offered no extra insight into the reporting process. For example, The Atlantic provided no other evidence explaining its confidence in publishing the claim, except for citing 2 anonymous people who allegedly, quote, heard Trump say this, unquote, and unquote from Snopes. Now, what if, has anyone considered this? What if Trump did say that, but he said it as a snarky joke, and then, of course, someone lashed onto that, yeah, I heard Trump say these words. I'm going to report as if Trump said it seriously because I don't like him and because I want that to be his Achilles heel in an election. Has anyone reported on this? Considering the character of Trump that we know and love or hate, whatever you think of him for all these years? Is it ever possible? I mean, we've heard all these criticisms of whoever being Hitler for 60 years. Why is it far from us even to consider that maybe Trump did say that, but is a kind of a snarky, goofy, jokey remark? So I'm not saying that Trump did say it. I'm not saying that Trump didn't say it. But of course, even Snopes recognizes that it's unproven. And so, if we're going to address the claim that Trump, in the headline of The Atlantic, said, I need the kind of generals that Hitler had, when we have no verifiable proof of this, mostly for election bluster, I think we could say, as far as being objective to this claim, hoax busted. Hi, this is Daniel Minnick from the Truth Espresso podcast. Truth Espresso is a member of the Christian podcast community from Striving for Eternity Ministries. And I encourage you to check out all that the Christian podcast community has to offer. And another great member of the community is Aaron Brewster, who goes by the name A.M. Brewster. He actually hosts 2 separate podcasts. One is Truth Love Parent. The other is The Celebration of God. I highly recommend you listen to them, and Aaron is also a speaker for Striving for Eternity. And unfortunately, Aaron has experienced hardship from Hurricane Helene. He stayed at his house in North Carolina to take care of his dad and tried to combat the flooding with powered water pumps. Unfortunately, when the power went out, inevitably, the flooding continued. While currently living on a meager ministry salary, Aaron has lost much of his livelihood in the flooding from Helene. Let's be practical and give to those in need. Striving for Eternity has set up a Give, Send, Go fund to help out Aaron and his dad. As soon as I heard about the situation, I donated, and I strongly urge you to give too. Just go to givesendgo.com/SFE. That's givesendgo.com/SFE. Please open your hand wide for those in need. Imagine losing your house and your car and pretty much everything you've worked for all your life. It's far easier to give to those in dire need than to be someone in dire need. Please do the easy thing and give generously and be a blessing as Jesus has told us to do. It's the biblical and Christian thing to do. Once again, go to givesendgo.com/SFE to help out Aaron Brewster, who has lost virtually everything in the flooding from Hurricane Helene. Striving for Eternity Ministries is a 501c3 nonprofit, so your generous donations are tax deductible. So please give generously to help out a wonderful Christian minister and podcaster, a member of the Christian podcast community. Once again, go to givesendgo.com/SFE and be a blessing to someone in need. And now let's get into our second hoax from the same Atlantic article, which was really what the Atlantic article was fanning the flames with. It's a story that makes a claim about what Trump did or said within this story. It's the $60,000 to bury a Mexican hoax. So this one is not something that we saw in 2018 or 2020 or 2022. This is a new claim, a new hoax. And this has to do with the death of a soldier in the Army named Vanessa Guillen. So before we get into the story, this is what the Atlantic said that Trump said 4 months after her funeral. On December 4th, according to Jeffrey Goldberg's article in The Atlantic, quote, Trump became angry. It doesn't cost $60,000 to bury a beep Mexican. He turned to his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and issued an order. Don't pay it. Later that day, he was still agitated. Can you believe it? He said, according to a witness. Beep people trying to rip me off. Unquote. Now, does that sound like something Trump would say? Now, Trump does offer a lot of bluster on Truth Social, but does this really sound like something Trump would say? Hey, I've never listened in on his private conversations, so what would I know? But it does sound like something an anti-Trump article might put into his mouth. It sounds like it fits narratives ever so conveniently, especially 2 weeks before an election. So what's the story behind this claim that Trump said something overtly racist and dishonoring about a recently fallen female Mexican Army soldier? Well, Vanessa Guillen, a soldier in the Army, was stationed at Fort Hood in 2020. And a guy by the name of Aaron Davis Robinson was a specialist in the Army there. According to an investigation on April 22nd, 2020, Robinson beat Vanessa Guillen to death with a hammer and buried her in pieces under concrete. That same evening, Robinson confessed to Cecily Ann Aguilar, his girlfriend, who was a resident of Fort Hood. Allegedly, Aguilar helped Robinson cover up his crime with the dismembering and burying. When Aguilar became aware that remains were discovered, she called Robinson and sent him links to articles about it. And on July 1st of 2020, Robinson shot himself to avoid custody. Aguilar was arrested and confessed to accessory to murder, and she eventually told the police that Guillen happened to see Robinson's cell phone lock screen that had a picture of her on it, a picture of Aguilar on it. Since Aguilar was married but estranged to another Army soldier at the time, Robinson could get in trouble in the Army for violating fraternal orders with such relationships there. Regardless, if Guillen thought anything of the picture or knew what it meant or even intended to do anything about it, Robinson seemingly didn't want to take the chance. Such a tragedy. Be sure your sin will find you out, as the Bible says. Cheating on a spouse and trying to cover it up ultimately led to killing an innocent woman, desperately taking your own life and then giving years of prison time to an accomplice girlfriend. And of course, she wasn't looking for this type of thing to happen. Now, the real story of this $60,000 to bury a Mexican hoax involving President Trump began on July 30th of 2020 when Vanessa Guyon's family met with him, along with their attorney. Trump said that he didn't want Vanessa's death to get swept under the rug, but the real controversy, or at least what the Atlantic seemed to turn into a controversy, is this part.
When would you like to have the funeral? When?
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible, I agree. As soon as possible with the funeral. We make sure that happens.
Ya,
Okay,
es que tienen que entregármela ya. Ya porque
Where will you have the funeral? Do you know?
Houston.
In Houston?
Yeah.
And if I can help you out with the funeral, I'll help you out. I'll help you out. Financially, I'll help you.
I think the military maybe can take care of it.
Good. They'll do military. That's good. If you need help, I'll help you out.
Thank you, President.
Okay, if they need something, we'll take care. We'll make sure she is very respected.
So, Mr. Goldberg's article in The Atlantic begins its body of text talking about Vanessa Guyon's story and does mention Trump's meeting with Guyon's family there. And it mentions Trump saying that he could help out with things, as we heard in the clip there. But then the article claims that on December 4th, so a little over 4 months after that meeting, that Trump kind of privately disrespected the family when he said that he wanted to help them out. So what was the conversation that we heard in that meeting when it referred to paying for the funeral of Vanessa Guyon? Trump said, "And if I can help you out with the funeral, I'll help." And he said, "I'll help you out financially, I'll help." And then the Guyon's attorney, Natalie Kawam, said, "I think the military will be taking care of it." And then Trump said, "Good, they'll do a military? That's good. If you need help, I'll help you out." Okay, if they need something, we'll take care, we'll make sure she's very respected. So that's what Trump said. So according to Mr. Goldberg in The Atlantic, on December 4th, Trump brought up the funeral there. He asked, did they bill us for the funeral? What did it cost? And then they mentioned that the funeral cost $60,000. And then that's when I mentioned the part earlier where it says that Trump became angry and he said, it doesn't cost $60,000 to bury a expletive Mexican. And then he turned to his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and issued an order, don't pay it. And he allegedly whined expletive people trying to rip me off. Now, Mark Meadows, who was mentioned in the Atlantic article, posted on X, denying these allegations. Meadows said, quote, I was in the discussions featured in the Atlantic's latest hit piece against President Trump. Let me say this. Any suggestion that President Trump disparaged Ms. Guyon or refused to pay for her funeral expenses is absolutely false. He was nothing but kind, gracious, and wanted to make sure that the military and the U.S. government did right by Vanessa Guyon and her family, unquote. So Mark Meadows, who says that he was in there, knows that Trump didn't say what the Atlantic claims that he said. And the Guyon's attorney, Natalie Kawam, was the one who sent the funeral bill to the White House, and Trump reportedly did not pay it. So what happened? Why did Trump not pay the bill like he promised? Well, did he actually promise to pay the bill? He said that he was willing to help. And remember, it was Kawam herself who said that the military would take care of it. And then Trump said, if they need help, he'll help with it. Vanessa Guyon's death afterwards was granted line of duty status, which entitled her to certain benefits, one of which is that the military pays for the funeral. The Army allowed Vanessa to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, but the final resting place ended up being Houston. Even the Atlantic article explains that Goldberg reached out to attorney Coam and got her explanation. The Army paid for most of the funeral costs while donations covered the rest. So why would the Army not cover the whole funeral bill? Probably because prior donations for funeral costs were already directed toward it, and then the Army covered the balance. So why did the funeral bill go to the White House, and why did Trump not pay it? Well, as we said, and as the attorney said, the Army and donors paid for it. So did Trump refuse to pay because of what the Atlantic claims about him? That he somehow acted like a Scrooge over $60,000 and because he was allegedly a racist against a female Mexican? No, this is a fabrication, obviously, from Mr. Goldberg in the Atlantic. So, just like the Atlantic and Mr. Goldberg himself in 2020 fabricated an idea for why Trump didn't end up going to the cemetery to honor the fallen World War I soldiers and relied on alleged anonymous sources to claim that he said something demeaning, it seems here that, Trump said he would help pay for the funeral, and then a bill was sent to the White House, and then somehow we see what Trump is really like, that he refused to pay it because he's racist against Mexicans and he demeans military personnel. But no, Trump didn't pay the bill because it ended up getting paid by the Army and donors. So sometimes you can have something like that. The bill ends up becoming null and void because it's no longer necessary. Trump offered to help. And did he promise to pay it? He said he wanted to help if they needed help, but it turns out they didn't need his financial help. So that's really what happened. Extraordinary claims of Trump racism and nasty comments to the contrary. Now, when Vanessa's sister Myra Guyen heard about all this controversy and political stuff 2 weeks before the election, she had something to say about it. So on X, Myra posted, quote, "Wow, I don't appreciate how you are exploiting my sister's death for politics. Hurtful and disrespectful to the most important changes she made for service members. President Donald Trump did nothing but show respect to my family and Vanessa. In fact, I voted for President Trump today," unquote. Ouch. You can just hear the hisses and snarls, and I did look at that post on X and see the comments under it and see people trying to promote the claims of the article while offering their condolences to her. But the hisses and the snarls, "Stop getting in the way of our precious October surprise. Don't you realize every election with Trump on the ballot, it's tradition for the Atlantic to publish an article citing anonymous sources who claim they heard Trump say something outlandishly bad about fallen military or Mexicans, or in this case, one and the same. And this time it has bonus points because it's a Mexican woman to boot." George Conway commented under Myra's X post. He said, quote, "No one is exploiting her sister's death here. This isn't about her. It's about Trump's sociopathic behavior. He displays it publicly and privately in his contempt for anyone else's lives, including those of men and women in uniform who made the ultimate sacrifice, is apparent to anyone who chooses, unlike you, to open their eyes," unquote. Yeah, that's going to go over well with the sister of the fallen soldier who has personal experience to know that Trump respected her family. And then Myra Guyen replied, quote, "Is that why the Atlantic is in your bio?" unquote. Smackdown. Now, attorney Natalie Coam, this is the one who actually told Trump in that July meeting that the military were going to pay for the funeral. She posted on X, quote, After having dealt with hundreds of reporters in my legal career, this is unfortunately the first time I have to go on record and call out Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic. Not only did he misrepresent our conversation, but he outright lied in his sensational story. Most importantly, he used and exploited my clients and Vanessa Guyon's murder for cheap political gain. I would like to also point out that the timing of this story, in quotes, is quite suspicious, as this supposed conversation that Trump had would have occurred over 4 years ago. Why a story about it now? As everyone knows, not only did Trump support our military, he also invited my clients to the Oval Office and supported the I Am Vanessa Guyon bill, too. I'm grateful we were successful in getting bipartisan support of the I Am Vanessa Guyon Act. And because of everyone's hard work and efforts, our service members now have more protections and rights while serving our country, unquote. So Myra destroyed the claims of Jeffrey Goldberg here, and then her attorney, Natalie Kawam, likewise posted and called out The Atlantic and Goldberg for the timing of the story and lying about it. Now, just to dig a little deeper into why is it that The Atlantic itself seems to be the periodical that likes to release these outlandish claims about Trump. Why would The Atlantic have a special interest in the outcome of the 2024 election? Well, of course, The Atlantic favors the Democrat every time, but this cycle is especially important. Remember Steve Jobs, the immortal founder and later re-owner of Apple Inc.? Well, when he passed away in 2011, his widow, Laurene Powell Jobs, transferred some of his investment assets to a new Steve Jobs Trust. Powell Jobs, in 2004, had also founded Emerson Collective, a limited liability company that donates to leftist political causes. And later in 2017, Emerson Collective bought a large enough stake to be the majority owner of The Atlantic. So Laurene Powell Jobs, the widow of the deceased Steve Jobs, who owns Emerson Collective that contributes to leftist political causes, now essentially owns The Atlantic. You know who's good friends with Laurene Powell Jobs? Vice President and current anointed presidential candidate Kamala Harris. Think there might be a bias for Harris and against Trump there? On April 27, 2017, Vox advertised the Code event for May 30th through June 1st of that year. The ad shows a split screen with Kamala Harris and Laurene Powell Jobs. And now, you may have heard an infamous clip from Kamala Harris at this event.
And, you know, we have to stay woke. Like, everybody needs to be woke. And you can talk about if you're the wokest or woker, but just stay more woke than less woke.
So we have to stay woke, and everybody needs to be woke. That's what you heard Kamala Harris say. And who was sitting next to her? The camera showed Powell Jobs sitting right next to Harris as she said that. So we get the feel that Laurene Powell Jobs, being good friends with Kamala Harris, who said that everyone needs to be woke, and Powell Jobs really owns The Atlantic. And of course, if Kamala Harris becomes president, what could there be for The Atlantic? Of course, other than just mere political connections, but personal connections too. The Atlantic and everything about it we know is leftist and Democrat to the core, but what special privileges would it weight The Atlantic and Laurene Powell Jobs with a Kamala Harris presidency? So that's some food for thought as to why Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic could lie about what Trump said about Vanessa Guyon and allegedly refusing to pay a funeral bill, and that somehow he was complaining about a mere $60,000, and that was to a billionaire, that's not much. But to an allegedly racist billionaire who doesn't like Mexicans and demeans soldiers, well, I guess that's when it becomes expensive. So did Trump say $60,000 to bury a Mexican in a derogatory way, according to Jeffrey Goldberg? Well, given all the facts that we looked at and the fact that he didn't refuse to pay anything, that the army and donors paid for the funeral, and that interested parties, including Vanessa Guyon's sister and her attorney, and Mark Meadows, all confirm that Trump never said that. But that, of course, only anonymous sources would have allegedly attested to Trump saying the outlandish things that they claimed that he said. I think we could say about this one, hoax busted. Well, that was part 5 of Did Trump Really Say That? And I hope that you enjoy these hoax-busting episodes. And so stay tuned for the next episode of Truthspresso, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Truthspresso. Be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast app. Truthspresso is a member of the Christian podcast community. Check out other great faith-building shows at ChristianPodcastCommunity.org.